Your health should be a priority, but for some people, there are things just out of their control that make them more susceptible to the effects of climate change. Things like age, race, and even income all play a factor in public health.
Hurricane Irma continues to remain a dangerous and life-threatening Category 4 storm with winds of 155 miles per hour.
It was sheer panic because they told me that they were going to take care of my mother.
911, what is your emergency?
We don't have any air conditioning. I saw her slouch over. I realized that she's not breathing.
As we arrived on the scene with our fire rescue crews, we made the decision to evacuate all of the patients.
At that point, I didn't know if my mother was dead or alive.
Emergency preparedness in the face of a hurricane is a matter of life or death, especially for our most vulnerable. Something our experts say must come into sharp focus now that climatologists predict more powerful and frequent storms.
I'm Lindsay Peterson, and I do research in the School of Aging Studies at the University of South Florida. Older adults, particularly those who are in nursing homes or in some kind of institutional care, are there because they have chronic conditions. It's incredibly important for us to think about what's going on inside these buildings when a hurricane is coming and what becomes of those people after the hurricane has hit.
Consider this, nearly half of Florida's nursing homes lost power during Hurricane Irma. That's 30,000 vulnerable people left without air conditioning in the summer heat.
We might not have electricity in our houses and be extremely uncomfortable. They might not have electricity. They might die.
The most notorious example of this played out in South Florida in the days following Irma's landfall.
My name is Vendetta Craig. I lost my mother December 29th of 2017. She was one of the survivors from Hurricane Irma in the nursing home in Hollywood Hills. That morning of the hurricane, my mother's caseworker called me with concerns she was not able to get in. The next phone call that I received was from my best friend. She said, "I think you should turn the TV on." I turned the TV on, and it was an aerial view from the helicopter, and I recognized it. And they were bringing people out on stretchers. And I knew it was an emergency.
According to reports, the air conditioning at the nursing home was knocked out, and staff members who were later charged neglected to call for help. Residents sat sweltering in the heat for several days before rescue crews evacuated the facility. By then, 8 people had died, 14 residents altogether. Craig's mother, Edna Jefferson, was hospitalized for heat stroke, and though she survived the days and weeks to follow, she never fully recovered.
Once my mother was rescued, she was alive, she was present, but she just wasn't quite the same.
Jefferson passed away 3.5 months later. Peterson calls the entire incident a worst-case scenario, but it also brought to light the lack of disaster planning at these facilities, prompting the state to act.
After the Hollywood Hills incident, Governor Scott reacted very quickly and came in with an order requiring nursing homes and assisted living communities to begin to install generators. And then the state legislature followed up and made this a state law.
Each facility must also have an approved emergency power plan and at least 72 hours worth of fuel on site. In the weeks leading up to hurricane season 2021, the state's database showed more than 24 facilities were not in full compliance. A concern, says Peterson, given how fast extreme heat can cause a health crisis.
Once the internal heating process begins with someone who is older, if their body isn't able to regulate their temperature, then they could easily succumb to heat stroke.
Not just those living in long-term care, but the elderly in general. According to the CDC, more than 1,200 Floridians were hospitalized in 2019 for heat-related illness. A quarter of them over the age of 65. That risk will only rise as days of extreme heat continue to increase. For example, according to the research group Climate Impact Lab, the city of Clearwater saw an average of 42 days at or above 90 degrees back in 1981. Now, that number has climbed to 74 days. And in another 40 years, researchers expect it to jump to 110 days, exposing even more susceptible populations to danger.
My name is Dr. Randall C. Morgan, Chief Executive Officer of the W. Montague Cobb National Medical Association Health Institute. We focus on health disparities. African Americans have for centuries been vulnerable to diseases that can be related to heat. Part of it is because there are underlying health conditions that make them more vulnerable.
High blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, and asthma. When it comes to excess in terms of heat or major weather events, Dr. Morgan says the ability to adapt is more difficult for people of color, and those underlying conditions can get complicated fast. Something brought to light during the pandemic in terms of disproportionate death rates and resistance to vaccinations.
It pulled the sheet back off of what had been hidden in terms of the inequities that make up social determinants of health.
Contributing to further health inequities are living conditions. Climate change and poverty are deeply connected, and neighborhoods with higher pollution rates and lower quality housing tend to be predominantly communities of color. Moving forward, Dr. Morgan and other clinicians pushing for awareness say cities must address climate change through the lens of social justice.
I'm Whit Raymer, and I'm the City of Tampa's first Sustainability and Resilience Officer. Social justice is front and center to the climate crisis. Low-income people disproportionately suffer the worst impacts of climate change. Maybe half of someone's income going to transportation and utility bills. They live in older houses, their air conditioning units aren't as efficient. So we need to put policies in place to help encourage our most vulnerable populations to adapt quickly to climate change.
Tampa is currently looking at programs to help replace older air conditioning units and fund solar energy, and is aiming to bring 10,000 new affordable housing units online by 2027. Raymer also tells us the city just wrapped up an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, which will likely be key in developing a plan to reduce Tampa's carbon footprint.
This is the new normal that we're living in, and there is a degree of uncertainty that we need to plan for. Everyone is trying to figure this out together, and I think that is hopeful.
It's a sentiment shared by all those we spoke with.
Our new normal is evolving. How do we adapt?
This is where I feel like there's a lot of hope. It takes forward-thinking people to move us forward.
It has to be a we thing. It's affecting everybody.
A daunting but vital task to keep this Florida we love, with its beaches and wildlife, vibrant people and lifestyles, for generations to come.